Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador. Now the macro lens that I've been using for the last 2 years is Sony's FE7200 F4 Macro G. Now I started using this lens instead of Sony's 90mm F2.8 G Macro lens because this one has blazingly fast autofocus courtesy of its quad linear AF motors, so fast that I can photograph insects in flight as well as stationary insects, birds in flight, and I've even shot motorcycle racing with this particular setup. Now it is admittedly only a 0.5 magnification ratio on this particular lens, so we either need to crop in post-production editing or add a teleconverter to take this up to 1:1 magnification ratio. Enter Sony's new G Master 100mm macro lens. This is an f2.8 lens and it has a whopping 1.4 magnification ratio. And surprise, surprise, we can even add the teleconverters to take this out to 2.8 magnification ratio. So this is going to be of great interest for people who are wanting to get really close and personal with their small subjects. Now, because it's got the same quad linear AF motors, it can shoot the birds in flight, it can shoot the insects in flight, and so it is ideal for somebody shooting handheld. Because it's also got optical steady shot, image stabilization, it's also ideal for people wanting to photograph macro handheld in low ambient light. Now the features of these particular macro lenses are such that it's hard to find these type of features on other macro primes such as the Sigma or Tamron. So when you're actually choosing a macro lens and you are shooting handheld, possibly in low light, these are perhaps one of the two lenses that you want to choose. So let's take a deep dive into the macro and let's take a look at the specifications and images produced by these two macro lenses. Now, I was an owner of the original 90mm f2.8 macro lens. Now this had quite significantly slower autofocus. Now in these close-up shots of insects, I would generally use manual focus rather than autofocus. I found it just a little bit quicker than trying to avoid the hunting that would be associated with using autofocus on this macro lens. This lens from 10 years ago also predated the 85mm portrait lenses, so I did in fact use this 90mm macro for portraits, and as we can see as we zoom in, it was incredibly sharp lens. There was no complaints there. It was one of the sharpest lenses that Sony had produced to date. I also used it for detail of street architecture because of its incredible detail and compression of perspective. I said that this is a 10-year-old lens, so we've seen lenses coming from Sigma and Tamron with faster autofocus, and so that 90mm macro was certainly overdue for a replacement because I was sure that Sony could make a better job of the autofocus. Now, I'm very much interested in macro on the move. Now there are going to be a lot of macro photographers who will focus stack, put the camera on bellows and onto a rail. This is not me. I'm basically using handheld macro lenses for subjects that are not perfectly still. And even if I'm moving just a little bit myself, I need incredibly quick autofocus on a macro lens. Now, I wasn't too sure when I heard rumors of Sony developing a macro lens, whether Sony might go for a lightweight approach, such as Lumix has done with their 100mm f2.8 macro, which is pretty much the same physical size as the 85 1.8 G Sony. So I would have been pleased had Sony gone down that route, but of course Sony had other ideas, and we've come up with a 1.4 times ultra macro lens. Now that's a magnification ratio is 40% more than the magnification ratio of the 90mm macro. And what we've got now is very fast autofocus. First, let's take a look at the specifications there. Uses a 67mm filter, which is a lot of Sony's prime lenses do use that 67mm filter thread. So I'm sure you've probably got some filters that would fit this. Now it's a similar sort of size and weight, maybe a fraction bigger than the 90mm macro, but given that we have that 1.4 times macro, I'm going to forgive this lens for just being a little bit heavier and larger than the old one. We have absolutely all the bells and whistles on this particular lens. We have AF/MF switch. Now that's two switches. We've got the one on the barrel of the lens, and we've also got one on the focus ring. If you are shooting with the autofocus and the focus is drifting a little bit, sometimes when you pull focus using direct manual focus or full time DMF, you basically just want to switch into manual focus to fine tune that. And having that on the focus ring is an incredibly useful place to have an AF/MF switch. Now we also have full-time DMF, as I said, on-off switch. We have the focus limiter switch, and we've got 3 positions for that. And we've got 2 custom buttons. Now I would perhaps put a subject recognition enable off onto that custom button, because sometimes when you go in super close, the camera will not recognize that you're shooting an insect when you've only got half the head of an insect actually visible. So I probably would program that for subject recognition on-off toggle. Now we have OSS on-off, we have an aperture ring, we have a declick switch for that aperture ring, we have an iris lock if you want to control the aperture from the camera, just put it into A and then enable the iris lock. We have an 11 blade aperture, which is what we'd expect from a G Master lens, and that's going to give us a beautiful bokeh if we're using this as a portrait lens. And we've got incredibly fast AF courtesy of 4 XT linear focus motors there. When we're looking at the performance specifications of a macro lens, I think it's more important that we look at the magnification ratio rather than the close focusing distance. This magnification ratio is going to dictate how big little things will appear in the frame. Now this is just a 0.29 times magnification ratio, which is not nearly as much as most of the macro lenses out there, certainly not as much as the 0.5 macro on the 7200 Sony and the 1.4 times macro on the new 100mm G Master. Now if we are working with just a lens that has a good close focusing distance and magnification ratio, we might need to crop in post-production in order to fill the frame with that subject. So one of the advantages of using a lens with a good magnification ratio is that we don't need to crop nearly so much. If you're looking at close focusing distance, sometimes close focusing distance might seem a very appealing statistic, but if you're too close to your subject, you're going to drop a shadow over that subject. So I think a preference for me is to work with macro lenses of 70mm and above, and obviously that 100mm G Master and the 7200 are ideal for this. Now we can put teleconverters on the new G Master and increase that working distance if we need to, not just increase the size of the subject but also work a little bit further away. Now full macro or just big enough. Now this is one of the important deciding factors as whether you need that 7200 F4 macro or the new 100mm G Master. Now personally I didn't want to get any closer to this particular crocodile. I think I'm close enough and this is big enough. Now this was just a 0.35 times magnification on this 100-400 G Master, and I've increased that magnification ratio perhaps up to around 0.5 by putting a 1.4 times teleconverter on that particular lens. Let's take a look at magnification ratios in a little bit more detail. Now this little frog was shot with the 90mm macro, but I was nowhere near the 1.1 macro that this lens is capable of. I was actually just around that 0.35 times magnification. Now I actually found it easier to shoot this frog with a 100-400 G Master, which also has that 0.35 times magnification ratio. Now this is only being cropped ever so slightly, so those subjects, those wildlife subjects that are not really tiny, can be just photographed with maybe the zoom lenses rather than a dedicated macro lens. Using that 100-400 was my go-to lens with fast autofocus until that 7200 Macro F4G was released a couple of years ago. The ultra-fast AF motors inside this lens opened up a whole new world of macro for me, and that was basically flying insects. With insect recognition on the latest Sony Alpha cameras combined with a very fast focusing macro lens, this opens up a whole new area for macro. And as you can see from these shots here, we're basically distinguishing from the flower and the insect, and so long as the camera can see the entirety of the insect, that is pretty much going to lock on and track. So I've got AF tracking using those quad linear AF motors there. And as you can see, I've done a lot of the insects in flight, which I think is a very interesting genre of photography. Now, importantly, one of the other features that is really important for me on a macro lens is OSS. That's optical steady shot. Now, image stabilization is a feature that many of the macro lenses do not have. Now this makes it a bit difficult to do handheld macro, in my opinion. Now one of the things that we often want to do with macro photography is stop the aperture down to increase the depth of field, but when we're in low ambient light we are going to be looking at either very high ISO or very slow shutter speeds. So having optical steady shot as well as the in-body image stabilization is the perfect combination for being able to capture these insects in perhaps dark forests, etc. When I take a macro with me traveling, and I generally don't work with a backpack, I work with a light messenger bag, my zoom macro has to be able to do more than just macro, and so it has to be able to do my birds in flight shots, my action shots, and as you can see it does a great job of that. This is obviously tracking very quickly towards the camera lens, and it's pulling focus very, very rapidly, even at close focusing distances there. So I've got many of these shots that you can also look on my Flickr Pro site at ultra high definition shots to show that this lens can pretty much nail the birds in flight. I've also used it on MotoGP. Pecco Bagnaia here is probably decelerating from 200 kilometers an hour, so I'm panning and the camera is basically holding focus whilst panning with this particular lens. And of course I'm also a big fan of events and street photography, and I also need my macro lens also to be able to shoot portraits with that shallow depth of field. So obviously even when working at an f4 aperture, as long as we've got those longer focal lengths, we've got good figure ground separation. And this is where the background bokeh really comes into its own, especially with the new G Master with the 11 curved aperture blades rather than the 9. I think you get the idea. Smooth bokeh is a must for a good macro lens now as well. 0.5 magnification ratio is perhaps the only limiting factor of that 70-200. I don't find the F4 maximum aperture as a downside really, because we really want to stop down beyond F4 when we're doing macro work, because depth of field decreases as we get closer and closer to our subject. But we do have that 0.5 magnification ratio, so I can only go so close before the camera lets me know I've hit the minimum focusing distance. Now I can crop in post-production if I marry this macro lens with one of the R sensors or the Alpha 1 Mark II. I can crop in quite a lot and then get a bigger magnification ratio. Alternatively, I could just put on one of the teleconverters. Putting on the 1.4 times teleconverter gives me a 0.7 times magnification ratio. Now if I drop into APS-C mode in camera with that 1.4 times teleconverter, I'm now just exceeding that 1:1 magnification ratio, or 1 times the magnification ratio. If I don't want to crop in camera, APS-C mode, or crop in post-production, I can get that 1:1 magnification ratio by putting on the 2 times teleconverter. Now my only reservations about putting on a 2 times teleconverter is we can start just to lose a little bit of the fine detail compared to just using that 1.4 and cropping in post-production. And I'm going to look at that in a little bit more detail with the new G Master macro as we move forward. This was captured with the 70-200 with the 2 times, and maps with just a little bit of care and attention on the noise reduction, because I am shooting in low light at f8, and also the sharpening. I can pull off a reasonably decent image even with the 2 times teleconverter here. And of course now we've got the 1.4 times magnification on the new G Master. We're not looking at teleconverters in order to get close and big, and we're also not having to crop in post. We can get really, really close and magnify very small insects and objects to fill the frame quite easily. Now, if we were to put on the teleconverters on the new G Master, the 1.4 times teleconverter gives it a new focal length of 140 millimeters, but also a 1.96 times magnification ratio. So now we're going into half insects, not full insects, but pretty much half insects without cropping in post-production. And we can go even closer. We could get that eye to fill the frame by putting on a 2 times teleconverter and getting a 2.8 times magnification. Now you probably will need to increase the shutter speed if you're working handheld, or look at focus stacking if the insect is absolutely motionless. So let's take a look at the 1.4 times teleconverter, which was pretty much my favorite for flying insects. And the 1.4 times teleconverter and the 2 times teleconverter don't slow down the rapid autofocus. Now I've sped up the shutter speed to 1/4000th of a second. I'm shooting now at f5.6 just to give myself a little bit of extra depth of field, so I ensure the body and the eye is in sharp focus. And as you can see, it's done a great job of this insect in flight. Now this little hoverfly is absolutely tiny. It's probably only the 1/8 of the size of that bee that we saw there, but the subject recognition is tracking that, and the quad linear AF motors is doing a sterling job of tracking that little flying insect there. And as he comes to rest, I can go in even closer. We're getting in really close now with this really tiny insect, as you can see here. A blue bottle, you can get it to fill the frame. I could possibly go even closer, but as I go closer, I am aware that I need to keep stopping the aperture down, and then I'm looking at the ISO as well. Here with the 1.4 times teleconverter, just getting into this dragonfly. You can see now only half the dragonfly fits in the frame. This is pretty much an uncropped image. Now as we get closer, the subject recognition for insects is likely to bow out, and so you might find the focus hunting around looking for the insect, even though the insect is front and center inside the frame. So what I would often tend to do is reduce the focus area to spot AF tracking and disable the subject recognition, and just lock the focus on some of the distinctive edges on that dragonfly's head there, and then let the AF tracking take over without subject recognition. So this is really where insect subject recognition may not help, is if you're working with macro, especially with the 1.4 or 2.8 times magnification, you are going to find that subject recognition less useful. A lot of people will often find that on some Sony lenses, if you put on the 2 times teleconverter, we have got a little bit of a loss of fine detail. Now, I don't notice that loss of fine detail on my 300 GM, and I'm really pleased to say that I'm not noticing the loss of detail also on this 100 macro. I am finding that this 2 times teleconverter is a really useful tool, as well as the 1.4 on the new G Master macro. And as we zoom into 1.1, you can see there is the fine detail. I haven't noticed any loss of detail in this particular subject here. And just to show you another couple of examples, just so you've got confidence in this 2 times tele with the new 100mm macro. Remember, I'm shooting at a 200mm focal length now, and you're seeing that the detail is holding up really beautifully on these subjects here. And just one final example of this meerkat. You can also see the very smooth background bokeh here, courtesy of those 11 curve aperture blurs there. So this makes a beautiful portrait lens, even though we're looking at portraits of animals in this instance. Again, going into 1.1 magnification, lots of fine detail. I have no hesitation in recommending this 2 times teleconverter on the 100mm macro. What I think is really important for me as a handheld macro photographer is OSS in the lens. Now I know we have in-body image stabilization, but this is primarily giving us an advantage on the shorter focal lengths. So as soon as we push the focal lengths out and beyond 100mm, we really need that OSS if we're going to be hand holding at the slower shutter speeds. I've dropped the shutter speed here to 1/30th of a second. Now for distant subjects I could probably go even slower, but because I'm working very, very close, it tends to magnify the vibrations in my hand as well. So I am pulling off a few pin sharp images even at this 1/30th of a second, and that allows me to stop down to f8 and also keep the ISO relatively low. As the light fades, you might find that you might have to open that aperture up or start looking around for your monopod. Another example, 1/30th of a second at f8, this time ISO 1600. And almost going into twilight now, I've had to open up to f3.2 just to keep the ISO down to 3200. Now I could try slowing that shutter speed down, but as I'm getting in really close now, I am finding that I'll lose a few more when I'm working with very slow shutter speeds this close to the insect. Okay, here's the 1.4 times teleconverter with this water dragon that I was photographing. Now this is giving me good figure ground separation. This is at the same aperture, but the depth of field is starting to decrease really rapidly. I'm shooting this at perhaps a f4.5, but you can see this is still incredibly shallow depth of field. And as I go even closer, we've barely got enough depth of field to cover just that eye on the left side. And this is definitely where you need to drop into spot AF tracking and also disable the subject recognition, just in case it starts seeing faces or other creatures in the pattern of the lizard skin here. Again, close and closer, and really nice close-up of this. So I am tracking this on the eye now with a spot AF point rather than looking for bird IF, because as you can see this was almost not a bird to the camera anymore. We're so close. And going even closer, this one at f2.8, very shallow depth of field, just looking at that second eyelid coming in over the emu's eye there just to do a little bit of cleaning, and you can see all the beautiful detail in there at the maximum aperture. So again, spot AF and disable the subject recognition. Now I'm going really close on the feathers. This emu is moving around, so that's focus tracking and just holding focus on the bird's plumage as it moves around just allows me to do this almost as if the plumage was sitting on my tabletop at home. And several examples of this showing you that it has no issues with this plumage here. Close. This is obviously possible with a 0.5 magnification ratio, perhaps on the 7200. This was with the G Master, however. And going in closer, half insect and closer still. And we're not really cropping in post-production here. We're getting this close, just with the macro capabilities of the lens, not leaning on the teleconverters or in fact the cropping in post-production. And again, spot AF tracking and disable the subject recognition. And I'd be disabling the subject recognition by using my custom key on the lens programmed to disable subject recognition. Handheld, 1/30th of a second, as I said, this is really where the optical steady shot comes into its own, and you will find that that feature is not available on many macro lenses out there. Full-time DMF, this is the ability to override continuous autofocus. So sometimes with macro, even with the limiter, we might find that the insect is so far out of focus, we need to pull focus quite quickly. And that can be quite tricky without full-time DMF. With full-time DMF, you just quickly turn the focus ring to get close to where the insect or small subject is, and then let the autofocus take over. So I think I would find handheld macro a lot more annoying without the full-time DMF. And of course, full-time DMF is a feature that really is only available for the Sony lenses. What I'm looking for, the specifications that I certainly am looking for in a macro are the ultra-fast AFC, full-time DMF override, optical steady shot, and compatible with teleconverters. So this puts the 7200 and the new 100 G Master into my list of lenses that I would consider for my own style of photography. Let's take a look at the competition. We've been mentioning the Tamron and Sigma. As you see, no stabilization, no access for teleconverters, no full-time DMF. The autofocus obviously being a lot, these lenses are a lot newer than the 10-year-old 90mm macro. The AF speed is okay, but if you're looking at flying insects, then again I would possibly recommend the Sonys as having the fastest and most reliable AF there. Sony basically released MTF charts for the new macro, and they're saying it may be even slightly sharper than the 90mm macro, and that's saying something. And we're looking at it being sharper in the corners than the old 90mm macro. Now, I'm not going to be shooting with the camera on a tripod and focus stacking, so this is really quite useful for me just to have a sharper overall lens, and certainly one that plays with that 2x teleconverter. Now I'm stopping down to f8 here to try and pull some corner sharpness. I'm not actually succeeding because this bird is more rotund and is actually on the move, so we're getting perhaps a little bit of movement blur as well. Taking a look at the sharpness of this lens at maximum aperture, I've picked out this particular shot of the emu, and let's go into 100% magnification there. And as you can see I'm in quite a lot of fine detail there in the reflection in the emu's eye, and I've certainly got no complaints with the sharpness of this particular lens, and even in the feather detail I'm super impressed with this lens. So we can look at close-up photography there. If you don't need that 1.4 times macro, I'd possibly consider the 7200 F4 macro with the 0.5 times, or even the 4 or 5 lenses I've listed at the bottom there. The FE2070 F4G has the best magnification ratio of a lens that's not designated as a macro lens, but we can see the 100-400 and pretty much the new zooms, the 2450 F2.8, the 7200 GM2, the 2470 GM2. They've all got really good close focusing distance, and if you combine this with an R sensor, then you obviously can crop in post as well and increase the magnification somewhat without leaning on a dedicated macro lens. So for me, if you are looking for that increased magnification ratio, it would be a choice between the 7200G and the 100GM. And if you're not wanting the extra magnification by using teleconverters or cropping, then obviously the 100GM has the vote. Now, just a word that I would have liked to also see a second GM or G Macro 100mm, the one that is a very small size, maybe just 1.1 magnification rather than the 1.4. But even the current G Master Macro is going to be small enough to fit in my medium-sized messenger bag attached to one of my alpha cameras. So not so big that I'm not going to rule that out taking it on location with a second body and second lens. Now just remember, I've got Patreon support. I've got 600-700 page ebooks for all of the late model cameras on my Patreon support site. Just a $10 subscription, you can download one or more of these ebooks. So just head over to patreon.com/Mark Galia, and I've got pretty much 100 hours of video support there, which is not on my YouTube channel, and this is a lot of learning resources. And I also supply raw files for all of my lens and camera reviews that you can download, and I've also got a Q&A forum for the Premium Plus patrons. Hopefully you've enjoyed this macro review, and I'll catch you online next time.